house about the appeals, which is not.
I know, whenever I say, I need to
Check that out.
Gotta talk to them.
that's what you want.
Hey, how are you, sir?
Waiting, I just wanted to make one scheduling announcement. This is a 6-week course, and we will have the second class will be on February 5th, but we will skip February 12th. So there will be no classes February 12th. We will resume on the 19th. So next class is on February 5th, no class on February 12th, and then we resume on February 9th.
You sure? Can you bring another table?
Semester of studies, all counseling. Two subjects that have somehow captivated the minds and hearts of so many people these days. One is relationships, the other is Kabbalah. We're going to try to combine the two and get some insight on Kabbalah as to how to deal with our relationships, specifically how to apply it to counseling, dealing with problems that we have as human beings. It's interesting that there's so much in today's society about relationships, probably the most popular subject. Just go to a bookstore, books on relationships are the biggest sellers. And you probably sell a book, even if it's about calculus and algebra or some other arcane subject. If you have the word relationship in it, you will buy it. It's such a mesmerizing word. Why do you think people are so much into relationships these days? I mean, we've always had the need to find relationships, to help with our relationships, improve on them, and correct the problems that exist. Why today, why do you think there's so much of an emphasis on relationships? Again, I can't prove statistically that it's more than in the past, but it seems that way anyhow. Why do you think? I'd like to get some input from you. Why relationships is so important today?
Probably one reason is because, at least in this society, relationships are failing. People are just very lonely inside.
Okay, that's a pretty negative reason, that it's because of the failures in our relationships that we need to find ways of improving them. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yes?
Like on the way technology is, and there's emailing and text messaging, it really distances people from like that one-on-one personal relationship. And you don't even play texting calls when you talk to someone at home, and it's also just text them.
Technology, texting is not that pretty recent. It's breakout relationships, you can say, go back decades. But you're right, technology definitely gives people the ability to not have to connect to others in a personal way, and relationships suffer. When there's a lack of communication, relationships always suffer. That's part of the negative reason. Did anyone think of a positive reason? We're focusing so much on relationships these days. Well, yes?
I don't think maybe if we're in a relationship, we become a better person and show a better side, you know, we get that to I don't know.
Absolutely. Why today more than ever before? Why is there such a, there are fads that come and go. It seems that relationships is not something that's coming and going. It's still very much in the minds of people. Well, I hope that maybe in the course of this semester, it might become clear that there might be some positive reasons as well why relationships are so important. Kabbalah is also a popular subject. Part of it is because of the popularization of Kabbalah by certain icons who have taken Kabbalah and, let me use a mild word instead of using the word distorted, but they colored it in ways that made it a little bit more attractive to the masses and a little bit less authentic. But nevertheless, Kabbalah is a very popular subject, and more people are looking to Kabbalah for answers to questions, existential questions, as well as dealing with our relationships. What I'd like to talk about today is Kabbalah therapy, what distinguishes it from other forms of therapy. I'm not a therapist. I'm not trained as a therapist. We have here some professionals, so they're going to correct me whenever I say something wrong, please. And my dream would be that we wouldn't need therapists. That's the ultimate dream. But short of that, my dream would be to have a fusion of the Kabbalah approach to therapy with the secular approaches to therapy, because they're both incomplete. You can't have a body without a soul. You can't have a soul without a body. The Kabbalah, if you will, is the soul of understanding who we are, what we are, and how we can deal with others. And the other forms of therapy, secular forms that have been tried and are successful and are being effective, they are the body. And you really should have a holistic approach to everything. And the holistic approach includes not just the mind, the emotions, the body includes also the spirituality. So those two approaches really go hand in hand. And I'm going to try to show the Kabbalah approach to it. And the challenge is to be able to fuse that with other forms of therapy. Kabbalah therapy is distinguished from any other type of therapy, from any other type of philosophy, in that Kabbalah looks at things from the top down. There are two ways of looking at everything in life. The way we generally look at things, because that's the way we are, we're human beings, so we learn from our experiences. So I look at the world around me, I listen to the teachings of the teachers, I read books, watch the programs, I'm influenced by all of those things down here, and then I start to draw inferences about what are the causes of things. We go from the bottom up. So our perspective on everything in life, and this is true in every discipline, is really from the bottom up. What is the given? The given is that we exist. The world here is the world that we know, and that's the world that exists, and that's reality. And then we try to develop a philosophy about what's beyond the reality that we see. And sometimes we come up to reach some very sophisticated understandings of the origins of life, the origins of existence, the spiritual origins. Kabbalah does the very reverse. Kabbalah is God's view of the world as it was revealed to human beings. And God looks at the world from his perch. And from his perch, the world looks very different. It's not the same world that we see. But to take God's reality and try to become God, we couldn't do. So Kabbalah helps us get a little bit of a glimpse of that higher reality. And the ultimate goal is to fuse these two realities, these two perceptions of reality. The earthly one, the one that starts with the ground and builds its way up, and the heavenly one, the one that looks at the heavens, so to speak, and works its way down into this world. So that's what we mean by Kabbalah therapy, looking at the world through the eyes of God's perspective and trying to make sense of what's going on here from that vantage point. Now, Kabbalah deals, just as we all do, with three types of relationships. We have, we begin with the relationship with God, although most people would probably not list that as one of the areas of relationships that occupy much of their time and much of their energy. But from the point of view of Kabbalah, that is the ultimate relationship, and that's where we will begin, our relationship with God. And I posit that if we had a healthy relationship with God, it would strongly enhance the other areas of relationship. But because we don't have, when I say we don't have, I'm talking about society at large, does not have a healthy relationship with God. And I'm not talking about people who don't believe in God. I'm talking about people who do believe, do not necessarily have a healthy relationship with God. Their other relationships are also flawed and suffer much. And that's where the intervention has to come from various therapists who have to try to repair things. But they're repairing it without going to the ultimate relationship that is the mother of all relationships. So that's our first relationship. The way we relate to God and the way God relates to us. Then there's, of course, what most people mean when they say relationships, how we deal and relate to others. But then we often forget the fact that there's also another form of relationship with ourselves. How we relate to ourselves. If you don't know who you are, if I don't know who I am, I can't relate to you because I don't even know who I am. I have no understanding of my own selfhood. It's important for a person to know himself or herself as a way of having relationships with others and with God. And in truth, all three are intertwined. All three go together. If you have a healthy relationship with your spouse, you'll have a healthy relationship with God as well. That'll help in that relationship. If you have a healthy relationship with yourself, it'll help you deal with your neighbor. If you have a healthy relationship with God, it'll help in the other two relationships as well. So the good news is you could start at any point in bettering your relationship, and it will always assist you in the other areas. The bad news is, I don't know if it's called bad news, that you have to work on all three. You just have the freedom to start where you want to start as a way of building up your relationship. But from the point of view of Kabbalah, the first relationship is the relationship with God. If you go to the text number 1, it's a quote from one of the sections of the Talmud called Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. Shimon the Righteous was among the last surviving members of the Great Assembly. He would say, the world stands on three things: Torah, service of God, and deeds of kindness. One of the great philosophers and Kabbalists and Jewish leaders of the 17th century, known as the Maharal of Prague, in his commentary on Ethics of the Fathers, says that these three, Torah, service, which is prayer, and acts of kindness, represent these three areas of relationships. Acts of kindness is obvious that it relates to the way we deal with others. Kindness is the source, the foundation of our relationship with others. If you have no kindness in you, you can't relate to others. It's not a relationship. A relationship that does not involve kindness is not a relationship. So if you want to cement your relationship, if you want to cultivate good relationships with others, you have to have acts of loving kindness. Okay, that takes care of that area of relationship. Prayer is obvious. And prayer is what gives us the ability to develop a relationship with God. That's when we speak to God. And that's the time when we develop our sense of who God is or who he isn't and what his relationship is with us. And by the way, God is not his or her, he or she or it. God is beyond description. But in Hebrew, there's a rule that whenever something is not feminine or masculine, the masculine form is used grammatically. That's where the idea of God as he developed, not because there was any gender associated with God. And if you talk about God's attributes, the way he manifests himself, Kabbalah, more than any other part of Jewish teaching, tells us that God has masculine ways of representing his his attributes to us, and he has feminine ways. So there's both masculine and feminine, but God himself transcends any type of gender. So getting back to the subject, so prayer is when we develop and hone our relationship with God. So we're left with Torah. Torah, though Torah deals with everything, so you could say Torah has all three, but Torah is best geared to teach a person about himself or herself. Torah is called light. Torah shines a flashlight on our own personality. And especially when you study Kabbalah, the part of Torah that is called the light of Torah. In general, Torah is called light, but within light there are different levels of light. Kabbalah and its offshoot philosophies, including Hasidic teachings, are intended to shine even a brighter light on our own personalities, to get to know ourselves, to know what we are, who we are, what is the dynamic, what's going on inside, so we can understand our struggles, we can understand our strengths and our weaknesses. Torah is the necessary ingredient to help us with our relationship with ourselves. So you have all those three, you have the ultimate in perfecting relationships. But we're going to start with our relationship with God. And why am I beginning with that? Unfortunately, God is missing from our lexicon. People are afraid. I'm talking about Jewish people in particular, and I'm talking about even rabbis who are afraid to invoke the name of God. Instead, they'll try to talk in terms and platitudes of love and all sorts of words just to avoid using the word God. It's a turnoff to some people. God has gotten a very bad reputation in the recent times. I know a woman who worked for NBC. She was a producer for NBC, very, very prominent person in the media. And she was an atheist. She grew up either atheist or agnostic. And then she started to get interested in Judaism, and she developed a belief in God as she traveled, I think, to South America. When she came back to NBC, and they were asking about her experiences, she knew that if she said that she believes in God, she would lose her job. Or she would be looked down upon as some, what's wrong with you? You're such a backward person. Instead, she had to find all sorts of euphemisms, all sorts of code words, the force, all sorts of words that were substitutes for God. As long as you don't say that word, that three-letter word, she was safe. There's a certain fear of God in the wrong sense of the word fear of God. So we're really missing a lot in our relationship with God because whatever the reasons are, God is not prominent in the minds of many people. There were two kids who were two brothers who were the worst kids you could imagine. They were responsible for every prank and for all the mischief you could imagine. And the parents didn't know what to do. The teachers didn't know what to do. The principal didn't know what to do. So they brought in this huge person in education, the top educator in the country. He was a real tall, heavy-set man with a very deep baritone voice, very commanding, very imposing. And the kid, one of the brothers, is brought into his office, and the man shouts to him, trying to use theology as a way of teaching the kid. And he says to the kid, "Tell me, where is God?" And the kid is frightened. He's terrified of this man. He doesn't answer. And he says again, "Tell me, where is God?" And again, the kid is terrified. He doesn't know what to say. Until the man starts shouting at him, "Where is God?" And the kid just runs out of the office, runs home to his brother, locks himself in his brother's bedroom, and he says, "You don't know what's going on now. God is missing, and they suspected we did it." So God is missing, unfortunately, from our lexicon, and we did it. We did it. I think God has to blame as well. I think he should take some of the blame as well. But God is missing, and it's unfortunate because all of our relationships suffer because we lost that connection with God. Even I'm talking about people who are believers. We'll get to atheists in a moment. We're talking about people who are not just believers, but people who live their lives in a good way, in a spiritual, in a godly way. They do the right things. And sometimes even rabbis who earn a living from God. They're on God's payroll. And yet, God isn't that important in terms of a relationship. Yeah, I believe in God, I say my prayers, but there's no sense of a relationship. But it's the foundation of all other relationships. And it's the most important relationship. Why is it the most important? Because there's no such thing as existence without God. God is our creator. He's our sustainer. He is our everything. There's nothing closer to me than God. There can't be anything closer. My parents, my siblings, my children, my spouse, my best friends, they're all distinct human beings. God is inseparable from a human being. You cannot separate the two. God is not just some father-like figure somewhere in the heavens looking down at us and feeling bad for us or feeling good for us and giving us some instructions and then letting us live our lives the way we choose, and he has nothing to say about our lives. God is the essence of who we are. How could you not have a relationship with who is your true essence? But there are reasons why God has somehow escaped our attention. God has done a lot to get himself into a lot of trouble because of the things that have happened in his name, the suffering and pain, and then it's the secularization of society that occurred in the last few hundred years. If you go back 300-400 years, I don't think you'd find a person on earth, a respectable person who would admit that they don't believe in God. There were always atheists, but it was not respectable. It was a minority. It's not a minority, it still might be a minority, but it's a growing minority. It's much more fashionable to be an atheist these days. So God has been thrown out of people's lives, some of it because of his doing, some of it because of our doing. But we cannot escape the fact that there is nothing that is closer to us than God. What about the atheists? I'd say that the atheists think more about God than most believers do. Because you can't be an atheist without thinking about God. You have to say, no, I don't believe in God. In order, yes?
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
That's all right. No, you can ask.
I'm a chaplain. There are very few Jews who are chaplains locally, but I'm a chaplain. I work a lot in hospitals. And when I work with an atheist, someone who was atheist when I visit them in the hospital, and they say, I don't believe in God. I say, well, tell me about the God you don't believe in. And that's how things start.
Okay, that's a very good point. Because the atheist has a relationship with God. It's a negative one. But you can't escape the fact that it's a relationship. And to me, a negative relationship is better than no relationship. I don't like it, to be honest. It's not what I want people to be atheists. But it's a sign that there's a struggle going on. They're struggling with something because God is really bothering them. And they're struggling with it, so they have to negate it. The agnostic doesn't have the courage to negate it, so the agnostic says, I'm suspending judgment. But they're both thinking about God. There was a story, not a true story, but this rabbi gets up one morning and he starts shouting, and his wife said, what happened? He said, I had a nightmare. What was the nightmare? He doesn't even want to say it. I had a dream that he died. God passed away. So she said, don't feel bad. You probably you think about God all day. That's why you dreamt about him at night. He says, no, I haven't thought about God in the last 30 years. The rabbi said that. Another story. A student, I'll make it a congregant, make it more relevant. Congregant leaves the synagogue that he used to attend and goes to another synagogue. And the rabbi is a little upset. This was a real good congregant. He paid all his membership dues and everything else. And he bumps into him a year later, and he says to him, why did you leave the synagogue? What do you have in that synagogue that you don't have in mine? He says, well, in my synagogue, the rabbi taught me to be a mind reader. You don't teach mind reading. Says, come on, that's preposterous. I don't believe that. You could read my thoughts? Yes, I can. Can I test you? Sure. Okay, the rabbi says, tell me what I'm thinking of right now. And he says, you're thinking of God right now. And he said, you see, you don't have the ability to read my mind. I wasn't thinking about God. And the congregant says, that's why I left you. So, the person who thinks about God has a relationship with God. The person who takes God for granted, though it could be a very religious person, you know, the title religious is a very easy title to give someone, they are not necessarily having a relationship with God that they know of. There are always these hidden relationships that we'll talk about later, but they don't have a real solid relationship. How do we develop this relationship? We're talking about someone who has the belief in God, but doesn't have God as a central part of his or her life. The answer is, that's where the human mind comes in. That's why God gave us a brain. The brain is intended for, first and foremost, we could use the brain for a lot of things. We use it for our work. We use it for pleasure. We use it for everything. But the one area that the brain was designed, this is from the perspective of Kabbalah, is to know God. To have the ability to have a relationship with God through the mind. And from the mind, it reaches our emotions and spreads throughout the entire being. Most people, I'm talking about Jewish people in particular, if you'd ask them, where does the culture of meditation come from? You know, everyone hears about meditation. Where do you find that? Oh, that's the Eastern religions. Not true. It's true that they have meditation, but it's not true that Judaism doesn't have it. Judaism always had meditation as part of its experience. Prayer is, of course, one area of meditation. There are words that we say, but it's primarily a meditative experience. And there's meditation before prayer. The Talmud records that the early pious men would spend an hour before every prayer, an hour of prayer, and an hour after prayer, 3 times a day. And the Talmud asks the question you're thinking, see, I'm a mind reader, then how did they make a living if they prayed 9 hours a day? The Talmud says they were so pious, God took care of their needs. So you will be able to read minds when you finish this course. So that's the tool through which we develop this relationship. You cannot have a relationship with God, a conscious relationship that is, without meditating, without thinking about God. So the atheist has one up on us, believers, because the atheist is constantly struggling with God, constantly meditating about God, the God that he says, or she says, he or she doesn't believe in. Once someone came to an atheist and asked them about God, he said, I don't believe in God. So the person said, you know, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. Because your understanding of God is lacking. If you would really know what God is, you wouldn't have that question about God's existence. So meditation works for everyone, even for the atheist, for the non-believer. What do we meditate on? There are several meditations, and we're not going to go through exhaustively through all of them. In fact, there are thousands and thousands of pages of material, especially in Hasidic literature, about meditations for developing a relationship with God. There were 2 meditations over here that are taken from the seminal text of Hasidic philosophy called the Tanya. The first, text number 2 here, on page 3, here it talks about a love, how to develop a love for God by engaging in profound contemplation in the depths of his heart on matters that arouse the love of God, which is in the heart of every Jew, be it in a general way, that he is our very life, and just as one loves his soul and his life, so he will love God, and he will meditate and reflect in his heart that God is his true soul and actual life. As the Zohar, the principal work of Kabbalah, comments on the verse, you are my soul, I desire you. This is what King David says to God. God, you are my soul. You are my whole life. I have to love my life. You are my whole essence. So that's a sense that we recognize God as our life. And the next one is, I'm not going to read the whole text number 3, but the whole text number 3 relies on a verse in Proverbs, which essentially describes what a mirror is. In the olden days, when you looked in the water, you saw your reflection. That's just like the water shows you reflection, so is the heart of one person to another. In other words, if I look at you lovingly, you will reciprocate with love. When we meditate on God's love for us, what God has done for us, then we will reciprocate with love for God. And this is something that you can't just read once. This is a meditation that you keep on focusing on day in and day out. Focus on the things that God has given us. And of course, we're going to get to that a little bit later, but what about all the things that God has not given us? What about all the things that he has taken from us? What about all the pain and suffering? Well, if you want to dwell on that, you're not going to reach a love of God that easily. If you want to have a good relationship, you focus on the positive, and then you start and you deal with the negative separately, which we'll talk about in a few moments. That's an integral part of dealing with relationships, dealing with the problems that arise in a relationship. That's why you need counseling. If all that there is in a relationship is just positive, then we wouldn't have to talk about counseling. So there's a reciprocation idea that we look at God as our life, of God, what God does for us. But then, in Kabbalah we're told that there is a natural hidden love that we don't have to manufacture. We don't have to create through meditation. See, meditation, or using your mind in simple language, can do two things. Sometimes it could create an emotion. If someone tells you about a certain product, they want you, a salesperson comes to you and says, I want you to buy this product. And you say, why? Why should I buy it? I don't have any interest in this product. And you don't. And the salesperson is a very good salesperson. What do? What does a salesperson do? They tell you about the benefits of this vacuum cleaner, how it cleans everything and does much better than any other brand, and it gives you a demonstration of it, until you're convinced and you spend $1,000 or more, money that you thought you didn't even have or you didn't want to spend, and now you bought it and you're enthusiastic about it. It created an emotion, your education, or sometimes it might be your the con job that the person did, convincing you that it's a good product. But meanwhile, your mind has the capacity to create emotions. That's much more difficult than the second approach that the mind is used for. The second thing the mind is used for is to unlock the emotions you already have that you're not aware of, or they have been suppressed. There are certain things that you really want. A person has, let's say, a bad relationship with a relative, a parent, or whatever relative it may be. You don't have to create a positive feeling towards that relative. You have to remove the thing that suppresses the positive relationship, because the love that you have for your parent or your child or your sibling or whoever it may be, spouse or whatever it may be, in every relationship is there. It has been taken away or suppressed. It's never taken away. It's been suppressed and buried. The meditation just has to remove the obstacle. That's a second function of the mind from the approach of Kabbalah. The mind is there to create emotions, and it's there to expose them and make them manifest, removing the impediments. And since we have, this is an axiom in Kabbalah, that we have within our soul a natural love for God. And where do we see this natural love for God manifesting itself? The Tanya gives the example of a simple Jew. This is a historical fact. A simple, unlettered, unsophisticated, uneducated, very materialistic individual who is subjected to a form of threat that if they don't profess to believe in another religion, they will be killed. And we have tens of thousands of Jews over the ages who were prepared to give up their lives for their belief in one God, not even to pay lip service to another God, let alone not forget about believing in it, even though it cost them their lives. Now, in every culture, there are martyrs. Even atheists, communists had martyrs, gave their lives for their ideals. But they were the most advanced in their theology and their philosophy. They were trained to do that. But here you're talking about a Jew who didn't care about God, didn't care about his or her religion, and they were still prepared to die. I'm not saying everyone would give their lives. There were many who didn't. But the ones who did prove the point that there's a hidden connection that this person has with God, but it's hidden, it's suppressed. And the meditation is there to activate it. So that's the first thing, that you need to have the meditation to either create a relationship. I could introduce you to someone, and I said, I want you to love that person. Okay, how do you love someone? Just because you're told you have to love that person? You can't. So I say, your mission in life is to love that person. You have no escape. You have to, and I can read your mind, so I'll know if you really love the person or not. You can't fake it. And they know that their life depends on it. So what do? Imagine you're told you have to love an unknown person that you've never met before. What do? What?
Start looking for good things.
Start finding out more about them, finding out their qualities, looking, meditating more and more about everything positive about them. You won't want to hear anything negative. Why not? Because you have to love them. You have no choice. So if you think about the negative, it's going to get in the way and you won't fulfill your mission. Well, we don't have the choice. We're commanded. V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha. You have to love God. That's a commandment in the Torah. But you can't command someone to love. Certainly not to love an abstraction. I mean, I can tell you to love a person, but how can I tell you to love a concept that you never heard of? So God cannot remain an abstraction to you. God has to become real. And since God, to us, is not naturally real, consciously at least, we have to create love through our meditation. But then, we're told, it's not as difficult as you think, because you do have that love. You didn't know about it, perhaps, but you have it inside your soul. You just have to activate it, remove the impediments. In truth, there are 5 dimensions of our relationship with God. Because some people will think, this is already beyond my capabilities. I'm not inclined to meditate every day. I'm not inclined to focus on God and dwell on God every day on a regular basis. That means I can't have a relationship with God? No, that's not what it means. There are 5 levels of that relationship, and they express themselves in 5 different ways. Number 1, acts of loving kindness that we referred to before. When we act in a loving way, in a kind way, to our fellow human being, we are crossing paths with God. That's a relationship where we're always somehow together in the same room. You know, if every day you go to the bus station, in the corner, to pick up the bus, and there's someone who comes there every day, just you and that person, after a few years, every day being under the same canopy, whatever they call those bus, what are they called? Shelters, bus shelters. If you're under the same bus shelter for so many years, your paths cross, you're bound to have a relationship. That itself creates a relationship. But it's much deeper than that here, because when you're doing something kind, that's a godly act. You're emulating God. You are intersecting with God, even if you're not thinking about God. You are crossing paths, and you're connecting to God on a level of action. Then there's prayer. That's where our hearts meet. prayer is not just saying words, which unfortunately to many people it amounts to that. They just say the words, and they may not even know what they're saying, or they don't care to know what they're saying. Even if they know what they're saying, they're not into it. That's not the ideal of prayer. Prayer is ideally a time when you emote. That's when your emotions have to come alive. The stories are told of the early Hasidic masters. When they would pray, they would become so emotional that they couldn't contain themselves. They would roll on the floor, they would shout, they would bang their hands, they would gesticulate. Not manufactured action. That was a result of their overflowing emotions. Holy rollers, okay? But anyone could roll. The question is it the emotions that get them to roll, or are they just rolling because rolling is the way they do things? We're talking about people who were their souls were on fire, their emotions were at the peak, and it expressed themselves in all sorts of physical ways that demonstrated what kind of emotions they were having. Well, we're not expecting everyone to start rolling in the synagogue, but your heart has to start to palpitate. It has to start to move. It's like you haven't seen a relative, a cousin for 30 years, and you finally meet the person, your heart starts beating faster. You're in love with someone. There's something you feel, a tangible feeling of love. That's what prayer is supposed to accomplish. It's supposed to work on your emotions. Whether you show them or not is not relevant. Some people show them, some people are able to contain them. But the idea is that there's a time when your hearts meet, when God's love for you and your love for God are in the same place. And then we study Torah. These are the three pillars that I referred to before. When we study Torah, but they're all, before we spoke about the three pillars as the three different types of relationships. Now we're talking about within the relationship between us and God, there are also three pillars. The act is what connects our physical bodies to God. The prayer is what connects our heart, our feelings. And the Torah study is where our minds meet. Imagine if I was able to go into the mind of some brilliant scientist, Einstein's mind, to really know how he thinks, just for 2 minutes, to think the way Einstein thought, or any other great scholar, brilliant person. We'd love to be able to have that meeting of the minds, to be able to think in the way they thought. But you know what? We can't do that. We can do much more, infinitely more. God's mind is infinite. Ours is finite. Einstein's is also finite. The distance between our minds and Einstein is like from 1 to 10, and God's is infinity. So they're both the same thing relative to God. And yet, when we study Torah, God allows His mind, His way of thinking, to enter our mind. And God's mind becomes inseparable from ours. And God's mind is part of God. It's His very being. It enters our mind. Our minds meet. That's an incredible relationship that occurs through the study of Torah. So we have those three levels. Then we have another level. We're getting even deeper than that. Tshuva. Teshuva literally means return. It's sometimes translated as repentance. What that means is when we blew it in any of the three areas, our actions were not loving and kind. We didn't perform practical, physical mitzvahs. We didn't have any feelings for God. Our prayers were lifeless. We didn't pray at all. And we did not study Torah. There are some people, believe it or not, somewhere out there that did not do any of these three, although